Good morning. May I invite you to join me in prayer, please, as we begin. The Lord be with you. Then let us pray. Almighty and gracious God, we ask you to give us the gift of your Spirit, who down through the centuries has called, gathered, enlightened, and sanctified the whole church, and keeps us faithful until the day of Jesus Christ. So open our hearts and our minds in our conversation this day, that your Spirit may indeed, through this time together in this place, call, gather, enlighten, and sanctify us, and urge us into renewed faithfulness. These things we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, who is our blessed Lord. Amen. In our last session, we talked about Mount Sinai, and probably as a surprise to everybody, a section of last Sunday's conversation was searching for Mount Sinai. I think the section was entitled, How Did You Lose a Whole Mountain? And we spent so much time on Sinai, we didn't get to St. Catherine's Monastery, which is a major point at the foot of Jebel Musa, or Mount Sinai. So the mountain of Moses, Jebel Musa, or Mount Sinai. So that today we'll begin by talking about the monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. And while it is not a biblical site, it is on a biblical site, deeply related to it, and in most effects very significant for us in Christian history. It's well worth our spending the time. I suspect that going to Mount Sinai right now is not an easy thing to accomplish unless perhaps one went at it from the Cairo airport and down the east side, the west side of the peninsula, although the Egyptian government has not had been terribly successful in keeping peace in the Sinai Peninsula either. So the process is probably that we can't go right now until things settle down in the Middle East, and particularly in the region around Gaza, which one must pass out of Tel Aviv to go to Sinai. While the Sinai Peninsula was under the control of the Israelis from 1967 until the peace accord with Egypt, when it returned back to Egypt, the Israelis put modern roads on the Sinai Peninsula, including a modern road, 2-lane but a nice road, to Sinai, and then back up into Cairo, and even an airstrip, which is not usable today, but which is there. And so it became possible for tour groups to go to Mount Sinai and to visit St. Catherine's with relative ease. The first time we were there was a Sinai village there that was, you had to kind of watch because the scorpions came in under the doors. It was not the most fun place to be. But the second time we were there, it was a very modern, like Great Western kind of facility, with swimming pools of several sizes and dimensions and all the rest, and even, of course, the shops that are everywhere in the Middle East that want to sell you things. So it felt like it was very much like the souk in Jerusalem. The monastery at St. Catherine's actually receives pilgrims and students. They can handle 120 guests. They provide breakfast and dinner, and lunch can be arranged so that you can go directly and stay at the monastery if you wish. It's a different kind of life, however, than other things, and you might want to consider that environment at the same time. Excuse me. There are presently 25 monks at St. Catherine's. There have been as many over the centuries as 200, but there are 25 there now. St. Catherine's was built by Justinian I between 548 and 565, but it was not the first monastery there. In the 300s, the 4th century, there was a monastery at a nearby hill that was thought at that time to be the Mountain of Moses. But St. Catherine, St. Helena, Constantine's mother, who went to the Holy Land and rediscovered holy sites, also went to Sinai in order that there be a chapel built to surround and protect the burning bush, which they believe is at the monastery at Sinai. And so St. Helena's chapel is there. It was on the ruins of St. Helena's chapel that Justinian ordered 200 years later that there should be the monastery, which actually is entitled the Sacred Monastery of the God-Trodden Mount Sinai. You'll see that in the footnote in bold type. But it has been for many years known as St. Catherine's. It has served for 17 centuries in this very isolated area, vulnerable and rather barren. It took a rather intrepid traveler or pilgrim to go to Mount Sinai and St. Catherine's Monastery, although in the years 382 to 384, a pilgrim by the name of Egeria went to the Holy Land, and she also managed to go to the Sinai, and she writes about it and has kept a journal to that effect. That's how we know about her trip there. But it was tough to go, and in fact, it takes an 8-hour bus trip today from Cairo, or perhaps 9 or 10 hours from Tel Aviv to get there by bus, and that's at the moment the only way to go. The buses are nice, but the trip is long. You get there one day, you go to sleep. If you want to climb Sinai, you get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you go up the mountain so that you can see the sunrise. And then you come down and you're back on the bus, and by 8 o'clock you're in Cairo. Even with a modern air-conditioned bus, it's a trip. But if I can lay upon you the opportunity to say it's worth going, by all means do that, though I suspect now it would be difficult. It's always been a Greek Eastern Orthodox monastery from the beginning. The monastery, along with several ecclesiastical dependencies, meaning sub-districts around the monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, forms what we would say in this country, the Diocese of Mount Sinai. They just call it the Church of Mount Sinai. The abbot of the monastery is also the archbishop of that diocese or Church of Mount Sinai. It's autocephalous. I was asked to describe that word. It's a Greek word. It simply means it stands alone. It is looked upon as being an independent church body in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, subject to no other ecclesiastical authority. So it stands alone, autocephalous, of one head, if you want to call it that way. However, there is the joint tie with the Eastern Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem, a gentleman whom I've met now 3 times. The Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem is the one who consecrates the Archbishop of the Church of Mount Sinai. However, he doesn't have authority over it. What he does do is every time he celebrates the Mass, he remembers by name the Archbishop of the Church of Mount Sinai. But that is the total ecclesiastical tie between Mount Sinai and the other Eastern Orthodox traditions. Are there any questions about that thus far? I keep going on. Yes?
Was there anything on this site before the first monastery? Did the Jews have any holy site there?
Was anything on what site?
At the monastery of St. Helena, before Helena was built. Was there any Jewish site there?
No, there's no Jewish site there to this day.
There wasn't anything, okay.
Okay? There's no Jewish site there to this day, which is rather interesting because it is of holy significance to all 3 of the Abrahamic traditions, which includes, of course, Judaism. There were, Carolyn, I would say that there were, from the first century, small monastic groups, hermit monks perhaps you might call them, who were there. And, but there's no particular record of them.
Do you find it interesting that the Jews would not have had this holy site?
We talked about that last Sunday, and yeah, I think it's interesting. My observation, very simply, is that the Jews are interested in telling the story, the holy myth, but not so much in preserving the mountain. You know, you won't go to a museum anywhere in Jewish tradition and find a cradle that Moses floated in the Nile in. You know, in our tradition, somebody would fabricate that, but that doesn't happen in their tradition. Other questions? Yes. Let me get back where I can hear you. I'm sorry.
Ageria went to that site in the 300s.
Yes.
And the monastery wasn't built till what, the 500s?
Yes, she went to the site of the burning bush, and she ordered that a chapel, and she reports that a chapel was built there. St. Helena is blamed for the chapel around the burning bush.
So there were other pilgrims maybe journeying there at that time? Or did
Clearly, it was a site of some significance because it was no easy thing for her to get there.
Oh, okay.
Okay? You had to want to go there pretty bad in the 3rd century to get there. So nobody's asked yet whether it's really the burning bush or not. Thank you for not asking. Next item. The monks believe it is. They protect it dearly as if it is. And there is a story that it was actually transplanted from an earlier location. None of these stories have scientific proof underneath them, so I'm simply not dwelling on it. But the monks believe it is the burning bush that Moses saw, through which God encountered Moses. This whole area, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but this whole area of Sinai was part of the land of Midian. Now, Moses was there because he was shepherding the sheep of his father-in-law, Jethro. And Jethro was a priest, a Midianite priest. So that while he's shepherding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, he is encountered by this burning bush. And so this would have been part of the land of Midian. That's why the bush is there on Sinai, when you might say, well, I thought that was in the Midianite territory. Well, this was Midianite territory at that time. Well, how did it come to be called St. Catherine's Monastery if it has a very formal and stilted name of the sacred monastery of the God-trodden Mount Sinai? How did it become to be St. Catherine's? Well, St. Catherine was a Christian martyr from Alexandria who was condemned to death because of her Christian faith during the persecutions, and she was condemned to death on the wheel. That's a process in which the body is simply broken around the wheel. A very painful, elongated process of dying. And the wheel did not succeed in killing her, so she was, as the legend goes, beheaded. That worked. Then angels, according to the legend, gathered up her remains and took them to Mount Sinai. It's also believed that around 800, the monks of Sinai, remember the monastery is now nearly 300 years old, the monks at Sinai find her remains, and it becomes now St. Catherine, and she becomes the patron saint of the monastery. Incidentally, the patron festival, the major festival of the monastery is the Transfiguration. Does anybody know why that would be? I'm sorry?
I think you wrote it down here, Moses and Elijah.
Okay, right.
They were on Mount Sinai.
On the Mount of Transfiguration, as Jesus turns his face to Jerusalem, he is met with Moses and Elijah, who talk with him about his departure. Moses and Elijah are also ones who went to Mount Sinai. First Moses, we know all about that. And then when Elijah is running from Jezebel, Elijah has killed 400 Baal priests on Mount Carmel, and they are Jezebel's priests. So Jezebel swears that as it is for the priests, so it will be for him tomorrow. Well, he wasn't afraid of the 400 priests, but he's terrified by one angry woman, and he takes off. And he takes off and heads south and gets down to Beersheba. There the angels minister to him, and then he goes on down to Mount Horeb, which is the other name for Mount Sinai. So that there is a tradition in 1 Kings and, of course, in Exodus of Moses and Elijah both conversing with God at Sinai. So the major festival for this monastery is the Festival of the Transfiguration, because it's the same Moses, the same Elijah who has appeared on their mountain as well. A very interesting story has to do with the Bedouin tribe, the Jebeliah, who are the major populace of southern Sinai. They trace their lineage to Roman and Greek soldiers who were dispatched there to fulfill the emperor's order to build Sinai. So they see themselves as former Romans and former Greeks who were sent there by Justinian, or as a result of Justinian's order, for the purpose of building and protecting this monastery. They believe their lineage is directly back to that time. Bedouin means people who live out in the open in Arabic, and they live in tents out in the open generally. Not all, but mostly. There has been this incredibly tight tie between St. Catherine's and the Bedouin, even though in the 7th century the Bedouin were converted to Islam. But they continue to feel this strong responsibility for an intense relationship with the monastery. They assist in its maintenance. They share in its gardening. They are simply a part of the monastery life. In 2 years ago, or was it 3, in the Arab Spring, when things came apart at the seams, that everything came unglued and violence sprung up in the Sinai, there was grave concern that the monastery would be attacked. And it was the Bedouin who armed themselves to protect the monastery. It's figured this is at least the second time that was done. They're believed to have done it as well during the Christian Crusade period, when the Crusaders could come rather unglued at times too, and nobody knew how that was going. And that may be the explanation for the mosque built in the 12th century, right at the beginning of the 12th century, inside the monastery. We talked about this last week, that there is a mosque inside the walls of St. Catherine's Monastery. And it is used, it is not large enough to serve the population there, and it's also, we noted last week, oriented in the wrong direction. It doesn't face Mecca, so that it is not the prime choice of a place of worship. But they do worship there on some festivals and other times in order to keep, again, this close sense of belonging to one another. It's a remarkable story. You encounter them today at 3 o'clock in the morning when you start up the mountain, and there they are with their camels for hire to take you up 2/3 of the way up the mountain. But they really are very much a part of the monastic community as well. Questions or comments? Then I'll move on. We mentioned again that there was this tie with Islam, and we wondered last week how it comes about. Well, let's get some dates together now. The monastery was built in the 6th century. Islam takes root in the 7th century, so the monastery is 100 years old when Islam begins its aggressive sweep across that part of the civilized world. And there is the legend, the story, the tradition at Sinai that Muhammad not only knew of Sinai, but had visited there and was acquainted with the Sinai fathers. So it was that when this spread began to move aggressively, the Sinai fathers sent a delegation to Mecca, to Muhammad directly, asking for his protection, fearing that the monastery would be swept away as some other religious institutions had been. In 626, Muhammad gave that assurance, and you see a photocopy here on page 2 of that patent of Muhammad. And you'll also notice that Muhammad's name is spelled 2 different ways in this paper. That's not, for once, it's not a typo that I've done. Actually, Muhammad is generally spelled M-O-H in English literature, but in some Islamic literature it's M-U-H, as you'll see the patent of Muhammad. I happen to have a copy of that here. Because it's in wide-spaced single sentences, it's several pages long, and I did not deem I had the time to reproduce 60 or so copies of it. But you'll see in the footnote how to get your very own copy. And it's very interesting because it grants, first of all, singular privileges to the monks at Sinai. They shall not be touched. They do not pay tithes. They do not pay taxes. They shall not be maligned. They shall not be prevented from maintaining the monastery. On down the line in 11 statements. And then we come to Christians in general, and it gets to be an interesting thing. Let me read just a little bit of this for you. Those Christians who are inhabitants and with their riches and traffic are able to pay poll tax shall pay no more than 12 drachmas. I did not look up to see how much is a drachma. Anybody here know? At any rate, it's a minimum. It's not a tithe, I'll tell you. Accepting this, nothing more shall be required of them according to the express word of God. And then he quotes from the Quran. If a Christian woman shall happen to marry a Muslim, the Muslim shall not cross the inclination of his wife to keep her from her chapel and prayers and the practice of her religion. That no person shall hinder them from repairing their churches. Whosoever acts contrary to this, my grant, or gives credit to anything contrary to it, becomes truly an apostate from God. No one shall bear arms against them, but on the contrary, they shall wage war in their behalf. Somewhere this has gotten lost. It is in the archives in Constantinople, but in Mosul 2 weeks ago in Iraq, Christians were given the demand to repent or be executed or leaving all their possessions there. Now this is the Islamic State, the caliphate that they're establishing there, which is absolutely in contraindication to what Muhammad has written specifically about the treatment of Christians.
At Sinai.
No. This is Christians anywhere. The Sinai is the first 11. Then we're just talking about Christians in general.
Thank you.
Okay? And by this I ordain that none of my nation, okay? None of my nation shall presume to do or act contrary to this premise until the end of the world. Witnessed by 2 pages of names. Yes, sir.
Really important because it shows that, as historians know, that when Islam came in, they treated the Christians really decently. In fact, they treated them better than their fellow Christians who were arguing about the nature of Jesus, and they put taxes on them. But beyond that, it's business in Islam.
That's correct. That's correct. Mostly Islam down through history has treated Christians rather fairly. Christians were required to pay a tax that no one else was required to pay. And that tax is fair, unfair, high or small. But that was largely the only but you'll see on page 2 a facsimile of the original document, and Muhammad puts his hand on it to demonstrate its authenticity. In the 17th century, a caliph demanded the original copy to be put in the archives in Constantinople, but provided several rather remarkable facsimiles thereof for the monastery to keep in its files. So what we're looking at is a photograph of a facsimile. But clearly, the attack against anything not Islamic is contrary to what Muhammad himself appears to have written, and it isn't challenged by Islamic authorities. So what's happening today is most regrettable for any number of reasons, but in Mosul and Iraq particularly, and of course, as you see, they're going through destroying shrines and other such things. They destroyed the tomb of Jonah last week in Iraq. So, as we say in archaeology, when you dig, dug, gone, so that you have to dig very methodically. Well, the same thing is true with shrines. Once they're destroyed, they can't be put back. And so this violence, this viciousness, is supposedly contrary to Muhammad's own personal intent. He first gives, to go back to your question, Marlon, he first gives 11 statements that deal with the monks and the monastery. And then he gives a series of additional statements that are for Christians in general.
It's very interesting to me since I have mixed things in my life, so to speak.
Of course you do.
And of course, one of the responses will be, well, it's not the Quran, it's the patent. So.
But who wrote the Quran?
I know. It's sort of.
Cometh from the same hand.
Good stuff, though. Good stuff.
Okay. Let me go on. The library at St. Catherine's, we were there 3 years ago. Doris, you were there with us, and we were ushered around the monastery by Father Justin, who is the librarian at the monastery library and is a native of Washington, D.C., as a matter of fact, and has been there since the mid-90s. At the time, what we saw was a gutted library because all the books had been put into storage because they were renovating the library, repairing its roof that was leaking and a few other things. And why? Because the library contains 1.8 million pages of handwritten text going all the way back to the 4th century. And so it is in Greek text. It is second only to the Vatican, to its collection of Greek texts that take us back to the very earliest life of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries of the Church and are simply priceless. Again, this library is located there, largely unknown by many, but not by all, and there are some stories of intrigue about it. I'll tell you the latest story, and that's about the Codex Sinaiticus. The Codex Sinaiticus is almost a full copy of the earliest full copy of the Bible that we have. And the Codex Sinaiticus was found at Sinai in the 18th century by a Russian scholar. Now, the story used to be a British scholar. Now its story is by a Russian scholar found it, he studied it, he identified it, they didn't know they had it, he identified it, he made great comments about it, went back to Russia, then came back again and asked if he could take it to Russia to have it studied by the scholars there, and he was allowed to do it. Major mistake. It never returned, and it is not there yet today. It never returned, and when the Bolshevik Revolution came about, they began selling off. Because they needed money, they began selling off treasures of the church. They would have altar books. You've seen us use them too sometimes, like 3-ring binders and large service books that a assisting priest holds out and the priest reads from it and all that kind of stuff. That would be simply covered with jewels on front and back. And the Bolsheviks sold all those. They broke them down and sold them all. And they sold the Codex Sinaiticus to the British Museum for $100,000, and you can now see it at the British Museum. You would think that us Westerners are honest and we would return what we know was stolen. The British knew when they bought it, it was stolen property. But then again, we're not immune either. The main archaeologist at the University of Pennsylvania was banned from ever returning back to the Holy Land because he brought so much material home and put it in storage, and particularly from Beit Shean. And most of it has never been put on display in the United States either. So we have mummies, and we have mummy cases, and we have coffin cases, and anthropomorphic coffin cases that are carved to look like a human being on the lid and all that, packed somewhere in a warehouse in Philadelphia that had never been seen since they were brought here. And the archaeologist who had unbelievable status there, second only to William F. Albright, was banned from ever returning. It's not a good story. In fact, you can see Amenhotep's throne room set up in total at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. You can stand in the throne room of the Egyptian Pharaoh Amenhotep. So, when do you give this stuff back, folks? It was kind of like we dug it up, we found it, and therefore it's ours. Well, the law doesn't read that way anymore. And the Codex Sinaiticus is a story much like that. An unhappy story. Nonetheless, this is a particularly valuable collection, as you would understand. And when the Arab Spring broke out, Father Justin and others began to really worry about whether or not the monastery could be defended successfully, and particularly these documents. So now they're being digitally copied and stored, and it's a huge project if you think of 1.8 million pages that have to be copied, codified, stored, and the like. The end result will be, you can see the originals at Sinai, or you can go online and study them directly, as you can now do the Dead Sea Scrolls, for those who can read them, but they are online now. Any questions before we leave Sinai for good in this series?
It's New and Old Testament, the Bible.
Yes.
Complete, New and Old.
Yes.
And that was my question. You
Yeah.
said that the Bible, that codex was the whole...
I have reason to believe it is only the New Testament, but the sources I was studying for this session say it's the Bible. Any other questions? It's just, Jim, it's no different than I don't know whether it's a burning bush or not. Well, that's not part of the copying. It's not in their hands.
It's in Britain. We've got to get the Brits now.
Oh, yeah. It really ought to go back to Sinai. Everybody knows it was stolen. It was agreed upon to be loaned to them to study and to be returned. But the monks tell one story and everybody else tells a different story, and so there it stands. Can we go now to Jericho? Let me begin by saying 4 years ago, Jericho celebrated its 10,000th anniversary. So if we get it accurately now, it's 10,004 years old. Let me put that in perspective. Written history begins about 4000 BC. We are talking about the founding of a city at 8000 BC. Okay? And add our 2,000 years and you've got 10,000. At 4000 BC, when writing began, we still hadn't built any pyramids in Egypt. They come about 2500 BCE. So when we talk about how old the pyramids are, then we can talk about, well, the city of Jericho was by that time approximately 6,000 years old. If you can get that in your mind or get your arms around how far back that goes. Now, if you look at the picture, the Neolithic tower at Tel es Sultan, that's the Arab name of the tell at Jericho. You know what a tell is? A tell is a point where cities have been built one on top of the other, until what you have looks like a mountain except has a flat top. Mountains usually have pointed tops. Tells have flat tops. If you see a mound of some height with a flat top, you know that there are levels of occupation in that mound. At Jericho, they have discovered 20 levels of occupation. So Jericho has been built and rebuilt and built and rebuilt and built and rebuilt. And why does that happen? We've done this before, but just for review, why does it happen that way? Because in order to have a civilized community, one must have, first of all, water. Secondly, fertile ground. Thirdly, a defensive posture. You don't build a town in a valley. Why? Because you can't defend it. You can't defend it. Today it doesn't make a lot of difference with rockets and all that kind of thing. But in those days, what were your weapons? Arrows, stones, hot oil. So you can't be in the valley. Unfortunately, hot oil rolls downhill, as do rocks, as do arrows. The trajectory goes further, plus the fact you can see down the hill and you can see your enemy. So you use the mound. At the top of the mound, you build a wall, and then you force the invader to climb the mountain where you've got a shot at him, okay? And where he must arch his arrows up, like the Palestinian missiles that don't know where they're going, they just cut them loose and fly.
For the 10,000 or the 10,000 people on top of that mountain in Iraq.
That's right. So that the bottom of in Iraq, yeah, good example. And they have no water. That's why the crisis is. So in order to have a city, you needed water, tillable turf, defendable location, and finally, surprisingly, even in ancient days, commerce. Some way of moving back and forth to supply your needs. So that the mound at Jericho, Tel es Sultan, covers 12 levels of occupation over a period of, 8,000 years if we don't count the current 2,000, because it hasn't been occupied very much since then. The picture that we have here, if you look down in the lower left-hand corner, do you see the black stripe in the lower left-hand corner? Does everybody see it? Okay. If you come on up, you'll see other like strident things too. You see them? They're not black, but you can see different texture in the soil. Those are levels of occupation. In archaeology today, you don't go in and dig the mountain until it's down to the ground. You dig bulk, B-A-L-K, or actually you divide it like a checkerboard, and you go straight down so that you can read the stratigraphy of the wall. What you're looking at is the stratigraphy of a wall that's been dug. Are you with me? All right. This tower, by the way, goes back to about 9,000 BC. Nobody knows exactly what it was for, but it was part of a wall. You see part of the wall here. It was part of a wall. It's not terribly tall, and there's a stairwell, see the doorway at the bottom, that goes up and comes out the top. Remarkable kind of thing. But if you look at that black line for a minute, that's one of the stratigraphy levels, and that indicates burn. That indicates the burning of the city. While burning a city is a tragedy for the people who live there, it's a godsend for archaeologists. Because if you look at that burn line, one of the things you can tell is it's uninterrupted. Do you follow what I'm saying? So that everything below that line is authentic. If you find a piece of pottery that you can date below that burn line, it's sound. Conversely, when you come down any one of these other levels, what you can't tell is whether somebody dug a garbage pit down 2 levels and threw garbage down there so that you have Roman coins in a place that was really early Iron Age. But the dating of the Roman coins throws the whole reading of the stratigraphy off. You with me? Well, here we see the burn line. We'll come back to that in a moment. Here you see some of the mud brick wall in the background up the upper right, left-hand corner. You see wall on the right-hand corner. And this coming inside. In other words, what you do is you don't tear down what's still standing. You dig around it. Turn with me, if you will, to the next page. And you'll see here a collapsed mud brick wall. And of course the story is the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. Well, here is some tumbled mud brick. And you say, well, that doesn't sound too impressive. Mud brick dyed in the sun was a tremendously solid building material and was used throughout the Middle East for a long, long time. It was cheap. It was easy to very often put straw in it to strengthen it. The Israelites working for the Pharaoh made mud bricks without straw. And then in the next picture you see grain jars in the bulk, in the wall. They were not taken out of the wall. The bulk of the wall was left as is. And the grain jars were filled with grain, and I'll come back to why that was significant in a few moments. Now, for about 1930 to 1990, there was a tremendous feud on as to whether the archaeological evidence at Jericho proves that Joshua was the reason the walls tumbled down. We wanted to sustain the biblical record. Well, in 1930 they said it did. In 1950, Kathleen Kenyon, a noted British archaeologist, said that no, that the walls came down, but they came down in 1530 BCE. That's about 200 years early for the Exodus from Egypt. So it would appear that while the Bible story may be accurate, and I'll get to more of that in a moment, it appears that most of what the Bible story says is true, but it would appear that if the carbon dating is accurate, that the destruction of Jericho takes place about 200 years before the Israelites ever got there. So it happened pretty much as the Bible tells it, but we can't sync the dates with Joshua. Are you with me so far? Now let me tell you how frustrating that is. In the 2nd chapter of Joshua, we hear about Rahab. Anybody remember who Rahab was? Well, I wouldn't say she was the manager of the red light district, but she's listed in the scriptures as being a prostitute, and her house was in the wall of Jericho. Now, this is the time I wish I had a chalkboard or a chart pack, and I could diagram ancient walls for you. Jericho had a wall much like the walls that came later, though more rudimentary than the later walls, in which they would build 2 walls and pack dirt between them so that battering rams did nothing but pack the dirt tighter and the wall stood firm. Are you with me so far? You couldn't just drive a hole in the wall. In those places were often indented areas where there was a shop or a house. And from the outside, you didn't know where was where and so forth. So it served its purpose. Rahab's home was in a house. From the earliest excavations in the 20th century at Jericho, and by the way, the first excavations were in the middle 19th century. And that was not when you did it scientifically with a bulk. You just dug a trench right through the mound, and so much that would be helpful was destroyed. So in the Jericho wall, there's evidence that there were houses in this wall. All archaeologists agree that there were houses in this wall. So the story about Rahab hiding the spies and then lowering him out her window on the outside of the wall fits. Item 1. Item 2. The Bible tells us that Joshua and the Israelites burned the city. Well, I just pointed out the burn line. It was burned. Third thing is the wall crumbled or tumbled, as everybody want to say, down. And there is evidence of the mud bricks that the wall did tumble. And virtually all archaeologists agree that the walls did fall. The fourth item is that it was a short siege. As you remember, they marched around the city 7 days, and on the third day they raised all the noise they could raise, and the walls came tumbling down. There's some evidence of an earthquake. Well, who knows how God tumbled the walls? It doesn't matter much. But so archaeologists find huge storage of grain in Jericho. These jars that they found were filled with grain. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that the city was prepared for a long siege, but it was not a long siege, and the food was not consumed. So those four things kind of tantalize you a bit, because that largely parallels what the Bible tells us. Now let me make it even more difficult. There's no evidence in the time of Ramses, for example, of the plagues in secular history that brought Egypt to its knees. There's no such evidence. So that the parallel evidence of what happened in Egypt before the Exodus doesn't help us much. However, about 200 years before, a dynasty falls and the economy of Egypt is crushed, and kinds of things that the Bible talks about apparently did happen. And what did I tell you the carbon date was? 200 years before we thought they got there. So if you slide it 200 years, everything fits. Only in order to do that, we have to slide the whole history of Egypt 200 years. And we think we've got so much evidence of the dates of pharaohs in Egypt that that's very hard responsibly to do. So there you have it. The Bible seems to tell the story pretty much as it happened. But maybe it wasn't Joshua that caused it to happen. We always want archaeology to affirm the Bible, and many times it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And this is a time it's a draw. There are archaeologists trying desperately to prove that we can adjust the dates of the pharaohs. Well, we'll see how that goes. You know, this is just the beginning. Questions? Kirk, did you have a question? Any questions? Comments? What I'm trying to say is I don't know how this morning to make it fit. Except the evidence is all there that matches pretty much what Joshua says in the 6th chapter. Other comments? Other questions? Well, we have two more things to say about Jericho, and then we're done for the morning. There's the Jericho of the New Testament as well. It is not the Jericho built on top of the 20 occupations of Tel El Sultan. But we have the story of the baptism and temptation of Jesus. It took place in the Jordan River and near the Jordan in the wilderness. And both are thought to be around Jericho. Jericho would have been a logical place for that to be. The temptation of Jesus, there is the Mount of Temptation, which is just on the other side of the old Tel El Satan mound. And as you stand on the mound, the cable car going up there to the monastery that's still there and now a restaurant goes right overhead as you're on Tel El Satan. I haven't been up there. You never have time to go. You kind of have to drive yourself down there. It's not very far. And just park your car and spend more time than the average groups do because you're going from place to place to place. But it is on the hillside, and it's very steep, and should be a thrill to go up there. And then everybody knows the story of Zacchaeus. Jesus was going through Jericho on his way up the valley, and he passes through Jericho, and a tax collector named Zacchaeus was so short he couldn't see Jesus. And I know what that feels like, by the way, because I know what it feels like to go to a parade and everybody in front of me is taller than I am. So Zacchaeus climbs a tree. He says it's a sycamore tree, and Jesus sees him in the tree. If you look at this tree, it's not hard to see that Zacchaeus could climb it. 2, it's not hard to see that he could be seen up in that tree. So the Zacchaeus climbs. So here in Jericho, there is the Zacchaeus sycamore tree. And there are lines of buses and lines of pilgrims all taking pictures of Zacchaeus sycamore tree. The only trouble is there are really 3 Jerichos. There's the Jericho of the Old Testament period, which is Tel El Satan. There is the New Testament Jericho. That's where Jesus would have walked through. That's about 3/4 of a mile away from Tel El Satan and 3/4 of a mile away from modern Jericho, which is where this tree is. So the tree's at the wrong place at the wrong time, and it's not likely to be the tree that Zacchaeus climbed, no matter what somebody might tell you. Well, it's an all right picture anyway. Now questions, or are we out early?
You talked a little bit about environment and climate. Sinai is obviously a really desolate, desert-type place. So when Elijah was on the Mount Horeb and he saw the cloud, and the rain came, it probably was a highly unusual event to have that kind of thing happen. What about Jericho? Is it a lush area? Jericho is an oasis that is lush. So I touched that in this paper, and you'll see it. 3 cities all around are still in the large oasis-type area. Jericho's pretty, well, sure. Going on down toward Masada, there's En-Gedi, which is an oasis area. But Jericho is lush. There's just no other way to describe it. It's talked about in the Bible as the city of palm trees. Date palms, oranges. The temperature ranges from 58 in the winter, which is really tough to undergo. So Zacchaeus was Fahrenheit. Oh, yeah. Zacchaeus has made good money. He's doing all right collecting money in that town. The temperature, and I've got that written somewhere here. Yeah. The temperature is 58 degrees in the winter, Fahrenheit, and 88 in the summer. That's the average year-round. So, and there's plenty of water. Elisha, of course, purifies the springs. If it was brackish, he cleans it. Yeah.
Some years ago, we were in Jerusalem. We went down to the Dead Sea. And just after we left Jerusalem, there was a sign on an old road that said this was the old road, Roman road, of course the Romans built them right, to Jericho. And I love it. What fantastic. Here you can see the road that actually existed at the time.
You can actually drive that road.
Can you?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You can drive that road, and along that road is the Good Samaritan Inn.
Is that right?
Yes. And you surely want to see that.
I believe
The only
the road
trouble is,
I believe the road was what Jesus was talking about. I'm not sure about that inn, though.
well, the inn or something was there because there's a well there. You don't take wells lightly, you know, they're probably pretty legitimate. But, you know, the Good Samaritan Inn, and they tell you the whole story and all that, except, according to the New Testament, that's a parable. It may not have been true at all. And anyway, they didn't have the Visa card the guy could leave to take care of him, so, you know.
There's a great bluegrass song called On a Jericho Road. There's room for one more, no more, no less, just Jesus and you on a Jericho Road. So I'm really
Yeah, you
glad
can-
you brought that up.
You can drive, thank you. You can actually drive out of Jericho on the old Roman road. It's drivable. It's actually in pretty good shape because the path is the old Roman road, but it's been cared for and kept useful. That's true. Other comments or questions? Thank you all for being here today. It's so great to have you.
That was so interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If we miss a Sunday school, can we go to the website and find?
You can indeed, and you can download it.
They are on the website.
They're on the website, all of them, including the recording of the session.
Oh, excellent.
So
Thank
you can listen to it and you can see it. And you're really better doing that with some regularity because, no,